Good evening. My name is Mike Fagelman, and I'm the Executive Director of HonestReporting Canada. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's important insider briefing. In war, the saying goes, the first victim is the truth. Whether by design or because they're being manipulated by anti-Israel propaganda, much of the world media delivers reports slanted against the state of Israel. Defensive military efforts become wars of aggression. Israeli peace overtures are dismissed, and terrorism is ignored or treated as an acceptable method of statecraft. The media plays a leading role in shaping world opinion. As the saying goes, what's reported today becomes foreign policy tomorrow. The consequences of inaccurate and biased reporting are serious when it comes to Israel and the Jewish people's safety. Today, we assess why Israel is losing the media war and what can be done to remedy the situation. And now, I have the great pleasure and privilege of introducing you to HRC's co-founder and chairman, Mr. Jonas.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. We appreciate your tuning in. We know everybody has alternatives and choices, but we appreciate your support, and you won't regret it. We have an informative and an entertaining hour coming up with what will be, I think, a very strong and moving finish to it, and then we will have a question and answer. So let me welcome to our Pulitzer Prize winner and on-air contributor to NBC and MSNBC, Mr. Bret Stephens. Thank you for joining us. You don't need an introduction for our audience, and I don't think for any audience. So I'm going to get right down to business with your permission.
Please do. Nice to see you.
In 2002, you left the Wall Street Journal, where you were an op-ed editor, to become the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. At 28 years of age, this was reported to be maybe unsettling to some of the Jerusalem Post staff and management. And you said at the time, it's reported, one of the reasons you left the Wall Street Journal was that you believed the Western media was getting Israel's story wrong. You said, quote, "I do not think Israel is the aggressor here." Were you right then? And is the media still getting Israel's story wrong?
Yes and yes. And thank you for obviously doing a little bit of research, because that quote dates back nearly 20 years now. I had been working for the Wall Street Journal in Brussels when, somewhat serendipitously, I was asked to start covering the end of the peace process in the year 2000, right after the failed Camp David summit. And I went out there really just purely wearing my journalist's hat and saw a story that was very different from the story that was being reported by many of my colleagues in the mainstream press. The story back then was that moderates on both sides, whether it was Prime Minister Ehud Barak at the time or PLO leader Yasser Arafat, were desperately trying to forge a peace accord, but they were being challenged by, the term was, extremists on both sides. And what I saw, spending a lot of time in Gaza, in Jenin, in Ramallah, elsewhere, was that that symmetry was fundamentally wrong. Yasser Arafat was providing not so secret support for the armed wing of his party, Fatah. He wasn't a moderate, he was an extremist in disguise. And of course, that about a month or so after I was there, the story erupted in the second Intifada. And I think much of the Western press has continued to get much of the story dead wrong, most of all on that fundamental question: who is the aggressor? You know, just now in the United States, and I'm sure we'll get to this, we have this question of Iron Dome funding. And some people on the far left say, well, why don't the Palestinians have their own Iron Dome to shoot down Israeli planes that are bombing them or defend their civilians against Israeli attacks? Actually, Palestinians have the most effective Iron Dome system in the world, far more technologically advanced than anything Israel has provided. They can stop shooting. And the moment they do, that's the moment in which they are guaranteed that Israel is going to stop as well. And there are multiple wars that attest to the fact that the moment Hamas declares a ceasefire, Israel stops shooting. So I felt I was right then that there was a fundamental problem in media coverage. I think that the question of media coverage is, if anything, more urgent today. I think because the stakes are higher now than they were then. But I also think there's a question, never mind for the interests of the state of Israel, there's a question about the interests of the media at large. I think the media, many aspects of the media, or many sides of the media, outlets of the media, have done themselves real harm in terms of their credibility, their trustworthiness with Western publics by consistently slanting a variety of stories. And I think among the most prominent stories that have been slanted in an ideological direction is the story of Israel and its battle with at least some of its neighbors.
Thank you for that. In keeping with journalistic coverage, I'm going to ask you a question that has a little bit of a Canadian content concerning Canadian journalists, but I think it's a universal question. And I'm going to put up a slide. This was in May. What's called an open letter to Canadian newsrooms on covering the Israel-Palestine conflict. And this was signed by over 2,000 people, hundreds and hundreds of mainstream journalists that write for our main publications, and you'll see them up there. And the letter was a complaint by the journalists, essentially, which complains about their inability to properly describe, this is a quote from the letter, Israel's state-sponsored racism, brutality, and violence against the Palestinian people. They never mention anything about Hamas, the terrorist group's aggression, as you point out, in instigating any conflict. And so we read in our publications that we do at Honest Reporting, articles covering the Middle East, covering the conflict, written by people who have signed an open letter complaining. I have to say, when I read this letter, I needed a seatbelt to stop me from falling off my chair. It was so ludicrous, but there you have it. How do you react, and what do you do when the mainstream journalists have reporters who are basically marching in a parade carrying a flag?
Well, this is a real problem with our profession, which is that you have journalists who actually think of themselves at heart as activists, or who cannot distinguish their personal views from objective, factual reporting. What that letter, in a sense, tells you, sadly, too much of what you need to know about much of modern journalism, which is that the people who are manning positions of significance in my profession can't have a hard time distinguishing between reporting and opinion. Look, I am an opinion columnist. I am paid by my publication to have opinions. That's my role, and it's a very specific role. It operates under very distinct parameters. I still get fact-checked, very carefully fact-checked. I still have to abide by all the ordinary rules of journalism, but I get to have an opinion. The paper also pays well over 1,000 reporters. Any newsroom, never mind my newspaper, any newsroom pays its reporters not to have an opinion. That is actually their job, is to keep their opinions as close to their own vest or their chest as is possible. And when reporters become activists, they're actively destroying the profession. I think that letter tells you everything you need to know about the ideological, where the ideological gravamen, center of gravity, lies in too much of the journalistic profession. And it's more of an indictment of those journalists than it is an indictment of the state of Israel.
Let me pursue this difference between fact and opinion. And I'm going to read you something you said at a speech you gave in Australia, handing out an award a couple of years ago, where you say this, and it's a fascinating comment. you say no country can have good government without high quality journalism, which can distinguish a fact from an opinion. The purpose of an opinion is to depart from the facts, to use them as a bridge to a larger idea called truth, and appreciates that truth is a large enough destination and that it can be reached by many bridges of radically different designs. If you were giving some benefit of doubt, I try to look at all these journalists who are decent people and say, are they trying to build a bridge to this large territory called truth from some totally other point of view? Or at what point can you discredit them for being hypocritical and biased?
Well, look, I assume, I don't have the list of signatories before me for that letter that you mentioned. I assume most of them are just straight up news reporters. So they shouldn't even be in the business of trying to build this bridge between facts and what I call the larger idea called truth. That's a job for people in my line of work. Liberals, conservatives, whatever, we are trying to collect facts and offer readers a certain interpretation of them, which readers can agree with, dismiss, or whatever. But really, good reporting has to be a very humble profession. It can be done very well, but the humble profession involves the gathering and distillation of facts, and at its highest level, an understanding of which facts are the most relevant to the overall story, right? I mean, a good journalist won't simply tell you the who, what, when, and where, but they will also pinpoint certain facts that have a peculiar relevance to the overall arc of the story. And that's a hard thing to do, by the way. You know, one of my favorite expressions from a great Jewish art critic in the United States in the 1940s and 50s called named Harold Rosenberg. And Rosenberg once talked about the herd of independent minds. It's a wonderful expression. And what you have, by the way, that letter that you cited is a perfect expression or a perfect illustration of the herd of independent minds. One of the real challenges of journalism is that once a kind of a narrative develops around a particular story, it's difficult for thoughtful reporters to work outside of that narrative. And I'll give you an example outside of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When I was in high school in the 1980s, there was a media narrative that Japan was going to be the world's dominant economy by the time the 21st century began. And so a variety of Western reporters would go to Japan, some with more of an understanding of the country than others, and they would basically report the same story. They would go to Honda, and they'd say, look at how much better Japanese car manufacturing techniques are there than they are in the West, or how much better the electronics industry is. One story after another. Meanwhile, real estate in Tokyo, as I remember it in 1989, was going for $10,000 a square foot, which was an insane number. It would be insane even today in most of New York City. So sure, you could go to Tokyo as a reporter and find great Japanese companies, but the relevant fact was that little detail about real estate at $10,000 a square foot telling you that there was a bubble that was about to burst in Japan. And so if you had paid attention to that countervailing piece of data, you would have known that far from being on the cusp of being the world's dominant economy, Japan was on the cusp of a very, very long period of economic stagnation. Same story goes with the Israeli-Palestinian story. If you had followed the media narrative, you would have assumed that something like the Abraham Accords couldn't possibly happen, because presumably the great story was that until Israel reconciled with, conceded to Palestinian demands for an independent state, there could never be deeper and better relations between Israel and the rest of its Arab neighbors. But if you'd actually been really paying attention to interesting, more relevant facts, you would have seen something else at play. That is that a lot of the Arab states, far from denouncing or hating Israel, were coming around to admiring Israel and understanding that Israel had strengths and assets that they needed to thrive or survive in their region. So it would be great if instead of offering tendentious and ill-intentioned and basically foolish opinions, that these were the nuts and bolts of their job, because that's job enough.
Well, maybe I characterize it like this. The herd mentality is in a way when the media have blinders on. The worst thing really for us at Honest Reporting is when they have a blindfold on. Let me give you an example. We have a picture of the Hamas militants. We run that slide. That's an army. That's Hamas. You will never see this in a publication, a picture of this army. And because that uniform is their uniform for the dress rehearsal. The dress rehearsal is everything but the battle. In the battle, they wear civilian clothes. A, because they can't be photographed as an army, and B, they have a human shield around them. So that can come down. So why don't anybody writing about this manipulation of Hamas, the manipulation of the Palestinians in Gaza by Hamas, and that's just one of many examples. But what can be done to improve that?
Well, it has to be called out. And look, I'll give you another example. This is pre-COVID, so my memory becomes hazy as to exactly when. It feels like, the time before. But this must have been in 2019. There were huge protests throughout the Gaza Strip. Were they about Israel? Were they about the so-called blockade? No. They were protests by ordinary Palestinians against Hamas's dictatorial, abusive, and kleptocratic misrule. It took days for much of the mainstream Western media to even acknowledge that this was going on. Why was that? Because it was terribly inconvenient to a narrative that wanted the world to believe that Palestinians in Gaza had one problem, and the name of that problem was Israel. It was inconvenient to the narrative to appreciate that there was a local despotism, a local theocracy that did far more to violate Palestinian than Israel was doing. So this happens, and I can offer any number of examples from over 20 years of experience of reporting from that conflict. This happens all the time. I mean, one of the reasons it happens, I should say, is, when a reporter is stationed in Israel, okay, he moves to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, he realizes very quickly it's a free country, right? Sometimes Israeli officials can be obnoxious. There is military censorship on particularly sensitive topics, but it's basically an open country. There is no reporter, Western reporter, living in Israel today who fears for his life or for the safety of his colleagues when they're in Israel, okay? Not one. But they have stringers. They have colleagues in Gaza, in Ramallah, where the pressure is not so subtle for those stringers to toe a particular ideological line, to not report stories that would be inconvenient for the Hamas narrative. And Hamas works very assiduously, not merely to shape a strategic reality. Really, the field of combat for Hamas is public perception. The field of combat is the battle, not the one they know they're going to ultimately lose against Israel, but the one they think they're going to win in the realm of public opinion. And the terrifying thing is that they've gotten remarkably far in that goal because time and again, a variety of factors shape a media narrative that is sympathetic to the people who are, to a group that is oppressing its own people and terrorizing its neighbors.
Let me ask you about a relatively new jargon. Maybe I'd call it progressive. I hate the word progressive because I don't think it's progressive, but everybody knows what that means. So I'll call it a progressive assault on Israel, spawned by wokeness, CRT, critical race theory, intersectionality, the idea that the oppression of one group is the oppression of all others. And this, I'll call it assault on free speech, is coming from several places. And maybe you could comment about, because I think it's infusing the journalistic attitude and maybe giving license to what would have been otherwise a more latent anti-Semitism to break through the surface and be seen. And we're seeing this on campus, LGBT, where are the outspoken social warriors when it comes to places other than Israel? Do you think that this, what I call a progressive assault, is that real? Is that accurate? And is it changing the ability really of journalists to get away with things they might have been called out on before this current moment?
Yeah, it's a very big question, and I am coming around to the belief that the single greatest let me put it this way, that the entire West is at an inflection point where we have to decide whether we are going to stick with the values of the Enlightenment, of rationality, evidence-based thinking, reason and fairness, or are we going to tip into what amounts to a new religious dogma with a kind of its own peculiar concept of virtue and vice, a certain type of demonology, which is called intersectionality, and a new cast of heroes and villains. And the speed with which this cultural transformation has happened, at least in the United States, I don't know about Canada, has been stunning. I think there has been a cultural revolution in America every bit as transformative as what happened in the late 1960s. The only difference is in the 1960s, everyone grew their hair long and changed their clothes. Here we pretty much look the same as we did 5 or 10 years ago, but things that could not have happened in any newsroom or any university 10 years ago are happening routinely. We're living in a new culture of denunciation, of newspeak, to borrow Orwell's term, and of a kind of a quasi-totalitarian insistence on monitoring not just the behavior of other people, but their very thoughts. And I think it's a particular problem. Let's put Israel to one side. It's a very particular problem for Jewish communities throughout the West. I mean, I'll speak about the United States, but I think Canada participates in many of the same basic trends. 4 points. One is that race is replacing ethnicity as the defining marker of group and personal identification. That's a big deal. At least in the United States, we used to be this salad bowl nation, right, of many ethnicities. And Jews were just one of those ethnicities. Greek Americans, Italian Americans, Chinese Americans, Jewish Americans, a whole variety of people who were sort of united simply in the fact that they were in the United States and they aspired to join an American mainstream. Now we have this new kind of racialism that is dividing people into people of color and white people. And so Jews find themselves, or a majority of Jews who are not Jews of color, find themselves being shunted into a racial classification that they don't recognize as their own. I don't think of myself as a white guy, right? I don't feel like I have participated in any system of white supremacy. I am the son of a woman who was a hidden child in the Holocaust, right? She was being hunted down for not being white. She was being hunted down a Jew. And so to somehow pair me in this new scheme with the white mass is an injustice to, I think, millions of Jews who feel deeply discomforted by this new racialism. Jews have never done well when racialist dogma becomes a defining feature of society. The second aspect is that the concept of success, personal success, is now being called privilege, right? There are all kinds of Jews who came to these shores in North America with nothing or next to nothing, and who achieve by virtue of hard work, effort, ingenuity, good luck, whatever. Okay, but now success is being called privilege, and privilege is being seen as a product not of individual merit, but of a system of oppression. If you go to almost any institution in the United States, you will find an overrepresentation of Jews in those institutions. Just one example, Jews are 2.4% of the adult American population. But last I checked, we were 16% of undergraduates at Yale University, right? So we should think about what it means to be, does that mean that Jews are enjoying privilege at Yale? And does it mean further that the real number of Jewish students at Yale ought to be capped at 2.4%? That's a consideration that I think ought to concern not just Jews, but any demographic group that in one area or another is outperforming its demographic representation. Two more things. Independent thinkers are being treated as heretics, and Jews have a long tradition of independent thinking. And the final thing is that conspiracy thinking has gone mainstream. And there is no bigger conspiracy theory in the world than anti-Semitism. And it's the other great conspiracy theory in the world today is anti-Zionism. Just a final point, I know this is a long answer, but what is anti-Semitism? It was the belief born in the 19th century that Jews were imposters and they were swindlers. They were imposters because they were pretending to be Europeans, whether German or French or Italians or whatever, but they were really Semites. That's how we get the term anti-Semitism, that they're not from Europe, that they're from the Middle East. And it said further, these imposters are swindlers because they're trying to swindle real Europeans out of their financial wealth or cultural inheritance or whatever. Now think of what anti-Zionism is, Jonas. Anti-Zionism is the view that Jews are imposters and swindlers, that they claim to have a Middle Eastern descent, but they actually have there's no Jewish connection to the land of Israel. That's the line. And they're swindlers. They're swindling Palestinians out of their land. So we now have come to a place where increasingly we're a nation that can bring itself to believe anything. And a nation that can bring itself to believe anything, whether it's Pizzagate, QAnon, the stolen election, whatever it is sooner or later is going to have no trouble believing the worst about Jews. So this is, I know I spoke for a long time, but this is the moment that we're in.
Well, it is an inflection point. One more statistic I'll add to your 2.4%, where unfortunately Jews overperform, is it's 2.4% of the population, but 54% of religious hate crime. So there's an incredible, one can only ask why, that's the big question. We may get to that, but why all this? And as you say, for the right, we're not white. For the left, we're too white. It's this no-win situation that Jews have found themselves in for 3,000 years. So maybe nothing novel, but it's distressing nonetheless. The other thing I wanted to raise about this is this assault has this underlying hypocrisy. So you say, here's the LGBTQ community that is very critical. You mentioned in a piece you did a couple of years ago at the major conference where the stage was kind of not hijacked, but not really. It was turned over to a group that was chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, which is just code for get rid of the state of Israel and kill all the Jews that happen to be there. And so that community that is supportive of the Palestinian cause, and there are good things in the Palestinian cause. We'll get to that. This Palestinian cause for self-determination, no one is disputing that. But a friend of mine joked that he saw a banner that said gays for Hamas, and that was like chickens for KFC. It's a little bit ludicrous like that. But where's the women's rights groups who are very vociferous? Where are they? As you write, they're roughly, in Afghanistan, there are roughly 18 million, I'm quoting you, 18 million women and girls in Afghanistan who will now be subject to the laws of the 7th century. They can't walk around in public without a male escort. Where's the outcry? Where is the human outcry against those policies when the US wrongly shoots 10 people with a drone, 7 of which are children, innocents? There's a complaint in the media. I can't even begin to think what that would look like if that was the case in Israel with a drone attack gone the wrong way. So it's this hypocrisy that maybe has always been there, but it's been fueled. And I want to ask you about something, turn a little bit to the US political system. And
can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Of course.
Because I think this is an important point.
Actually, it's not an interruption. You're the headline. I'm the interruption.
So this is an important point. There are problems with the activist side of some of these communities, usually self-appointed leaders, usually people on the very far, on the political fringes of the spectrum who have anointed themselves as leaders of this or that group. I mean, I think when you say LGBTQ community, let's be clear, I suspect the overwhelming majority, I've never seen polling, of the LGBTQ community would know very well that Tel Aviv is an incredibly friendly LGBTQ destination and Gaza isn't, right? But what isn't translating here is the views of what I suspect is the majority of that community into the activist side of it. Again, the same story with the Women's March. I mean, after Trump's election, my eldest daughter and my wife marched in the Women's March, not knowing that the leaders of that, or some of the leaders of that march, were vitriolically anti-Semitic. So I just want to be, clear that I'm not indicting entire groups or movements. But the issue here is that you have leadership in many of these organizations that sees the world through an extreme ideological prism and claims to speak in the names of people who never voted them into any kind of office.
Well, I guess the point is not that, I certainly didn't intend to say anything negative about any of these communities, only that is there an obligation in a community, in a group that is bonded together for a particular purpose, social, economic, whatever, to marshal and control its members to some degree. And so when a stage is handed over to people who are extremely vocal and we're making that chant, it's not to impugn the community whose stage it was, nor the conference, but simply that at some point, is there a monitoring of statements that are made on a platform that belongs to something else?
Look, obviously these communities, it's not like there is, LGBTQ is just happens to be an identity, right? It's not like the American Jewish Committee or an organization. It's an identity, that applies to millions of people. And by the way, there are extraordinary groups. One that comes to mind is A Wider Bridge, which is an LGBTQ pro-Israel community trying to bridge the gay community in North America, or at least in the United States, with one in Israel. And they do really, really important work. What saddens me, though, is so many of these groups get almost no attention in media. They have sort of shoestring budgets. They're not relevant to, they don't seem to be particularly relevant to the people who are otherwise funding, other major initiatives. But they're doing really important work that we ought to care about. Now speaking not as a journalist, I'm speaking as a Jew, that we ought to care about in terms of making sure that, various kinds of minority groups simply aren't represented monolithically as being haters and opponents of the state of Israel or as bordering on anti-Semitism.
Let me ask you about the Democratic Party and the polarization, not between Democrats and Republicans, which is well documented, and I think you say your party marriage is the new family taboo, but within the Democratic Party itself, has the progressive side of this party in some way fueled a more brazen attack on Israel and the Jews?
Oh, for sure. And the greatest illustration of that is what has just transpired in the Congress when a handful of progressive Democrats decided they were perfectly happy to embarrass the President of the United States, to hold hostage the federal budget of the United States government, to embarrass their own leaders, and to hand the Republican Party a golden talking point, all for the sake of trying to hold up funding for Iron Dome. This wasn't giving peace a chance. This was giving Hamas a chance to kill Israelis. Look, I think most people on this call know, I'm a never Trump conservative. I was a leading member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal for a long time. But when the Trump movement came around, I felt very strongly that this was not something that I could be in any way a part of. It was wrong at its core. Even when I agreed with some of its policies, there was something dangerous to our liberal democracy about it. And I think it's enormously important for people who are on one side or the other of the political spectrum to monitor their own side. And what worries me now about the progressive ascendancy in the United States isn't that they represent a majority of liberals or Democrats. That clearly don't. The House just voted overwhelmingly to fund Iron Dome. What really worries me is a sense among too much of the Democratic Party leadership that they don't have the fortitude to denounce and censure people like Ilhan Omar when she repeatedly makes nakedly anti-Semitic comments. Rashida Tlaib, just a month ago, made, the loudest anti-Semitic dog whistle imaginable. And it passed as if no one had said anything, like it was not worth commenting on. So my fear about the Democratic Party, Jonas, isn't so much that it's being overtaken by progressives. It's that it's not. It is the classic case of the triumph of evil through good men doing nothing. That's attributed to Edmund Burke. If the Democratic Party isn't careful, the same fate that befell the British Labour Party when Jeremy Corbyn took over could happen to the Democratic Party as well. And the way you stop that from happening is very early on, you identify a real moral cancer in your party, and you say, we don't accept this as part of the Democratic brand, period, even if we're going to have to lose an election or a House seat to make that point.
Let me turn to what I'll call the language of anti-Semitism or Jew hatred, which is probably a better way of calling it. And really, the two sides of a coin. On the one side, you have the inflammatory words to describe Israel as the oppressor, and the heroic, sympathetic words to describe the Palestinians. And this has really become the battlefield. So we have phrases that ethnic cleansing, colonialization, apartheid, and on the other hand, there's a different lexicon, which we'll come to in a moment, that describes the Palestinian side. But on his description of the Israeli side, this characterization that has become part of the narrative, ethnic cleansing, and the facts are totally contrary. You have the best line I've heard on ethnic cleansing, where I'll give you back what you said. The only ethnic cleansing by Israel has been in Gaza in 2005 when they removed all the Jews. But how do we move away, colonial and to our ancestral land, and apartheid? Obviously, we have representation of the Arab community in the Supreme Court, at universities, and business, throughout, in government. How do we move away from that kind of script that keeps getting repeated? What can be done about it?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. First of all, I think too often the right has, the non-left, I don't want to call it the right because there's a lot of center in it too, has basically ceded the battle of words. Once you start calling the results of 1967 the occupation, right? you've already lost 90% of your argument. I mean, the West Bank, okay, was always contested, right? Always had been contested. It was contested when in 1947 and 48 during the partition and the War of War of Independence. Remained contested there. Remains contested now. The Green Line is not an international border; it's an armistice line. Start saying occupation, however, and well, that the moment that happens, you are already losing. You're already losing a battle of ideas. During the Intifada, right? Palestinians called it the Intifada for a reason. You know, it's just a shaking off, and it was the second Intifada. It had a quality of referring to the first Intifada. And then they called it the Al-Aqsa Intifada, which gave it a religious dimension. So it wasn't simply a territorial dispute between Palestinians and Israelis. It became a holy war because it was over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. What did Israelis call it at the time? They called it the Matzab. They called it the situation, right? So the fact that Israel was not, didn't have a word for what they were fighting for, which was in fact a struggle for their very survival, made Israel's challenge really, really a great one. At the same time, it's also worth using these words against, okay, colonialism. What's colonial is that the land of Israel was occupied by a series of colonizers, from the Byzantine Empire, from the Romans to the Byzantines, ultimately the Ottomans, and then the British. And Zionism is not a colonial movement, it's a liberation movement, which, by the way, came about at the same time that other liberation movements swept much of the developing world. So you can do one of two things. You can either insist on clear and more descriptive and neutral terms, which is a tough job, but it's worth doing. Or you can simply take the language that is being deployed against Israel and turn it around. And that's also another way of thinking about this. You know, ultimately what matters, and this is a point I want to make sure I make, you know, here clearly. You know, I have deep Jewish roots, and that's an aspect of my identity. But when I went to Israel in 2002 to take over the Jerusalem Post, and this gets back to your first question, I wasn't going there as a Jewish Hasbara advocate. I was going there as a journalist who was convinced that my profession was by and large getting a story wrong. And what matters here isn't simply to win a contest, right? What matters here is also to get the story right? To be honest and clear about actual, identifiable, objective, historical facts, right? What we need now isn't simply biased journalism on the other side. That would serve nobody. What we need is an actual objective journalism that approaches the truth much better than what we have now. And sometimes that will not help Israel, okay? Israel's not a nation of saints, all right? But at least we will be having this conversation on the level of factual objectivity and not dogma and ideology.
Let me turn to a recent example of creating a narrative, if I call it that. There was a recent protest at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art. It was part of a series of protests. I think it was this week. I'm interested in the art world, have a foot in that world. And so we have a picture of that protest. So this is a protest at MoMA. And there's a woman holding a spoon and a Palestinian flag in the background. And caption is, it's a reporter, protester holding a spoon, a new symbol of Palestinian resistance at a demonstration outside New York's MoMA. Take that down. And I thought this is interesting to me on two counts. One is, what are they doing at MoMA? And the part of the ongoing protest has been, there's been some Jewish trustees who have an involvement in Israel. For example, Mr. Lauder, who was instrumental in birthright. So because of that educational program, he has an affiliation. That's a cause for protest. But the more interesting part of this is that the spoon, this is sort of symbolic of the idea was a spoon was used to create a tunnel that was a tunnel to freedom. This is Steve McQueen's Great Escape out of the 60s, except there's this heroic escape to freedom by 6 Palestinians, all of whom have been recaptured, 4 of whom were part of Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad, by their own words, are dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel and all Jews. There is no desire for peace in Islamic Jihad. One of the terrorists, Mohammed Arada, this is as reported by Ite Ram in this week's Haaretz, was convicted because of a bombing that took place that killed 3 people in a bomb. He didn't do this to seek to promote, he says, a just solution for both peoples, but to sabotage the chances of achieving it. It was not a heroic act against the soldiers of the occupation, but part of a murder spree against civilians. This is, by implication, what is this protest about, and the elevation of this murder celebrated in a protest with a spoon as a sign of liberation. How do you deal with that? I'm speechless about this. And what should be the commentary? What should be the op-ed about this that doesn't distinguish between the Palestinian who was in jail for murdering, blowing up a bus, versus the Palestinian who entirely innocently is entitled to his own self-determination, as Jews are, but are all cast together and celebrated?
Yeah, look, I have to say, living a little closer to New York City than you are, I hadn't even heard of that protest because during UN week, all kinds of stuff goes on. But it's sort of a piece, right, with a kind of a broad set of protest movements today that are obviously gaining a terrifying amount of grip. And I think the only way in which you respond is by saying the goal of this protest is to celebrate and support people who want to kill Jews. And so if you are in the protest or support the protest or are even indifferent, morally speaking, to that protest, you are not very different. In fact, you are cut from exactly the same cloth of people who wanted to kill Jews throughout history, including in the 1930s and 1940s. So it's just worth making that point. And usually for very good reasons, my observation is that American Jews are very, very wary of kind of drawing obvious moral inferences or making accusations which seem provocative or aggressive. But I think we are living in a period which has the hints, the sense, the smell of the beginning of a new wave of virulent anti-Semitism sweeping the West. And I think Jews have a responsibility to themselves and their children to have an instinct for danger and to sense which way the wind is blowing, and to do something while they have the institutional muscle and the political influence and the social significance to make effectual change. Because in 10 years, it might be very different. In 10 years, the people with the spoons may be the trustees at the museum.
Let me ask you about social media, and I'm mindful of the time. We have so much to cover, so I've got to ask you about a few things. Social media, our new battlefield, and we saw this during the 11-day conflict in May. The complete lack of accountability. Is this the end of truth? Is this the new journalism? And who sets the standards for this, and where is the accountability?
That's a great question. I mean, if I were the benign dictator of the journalistic world, one thing I would do is insist that no journalist has a personal Twitter account. Or a Facebook page. All of that should be handled in the same way that our public profiles are handled in every other way, to minimize the possibility that an audience may get to know what our own personal thinking is all about. I hate the term social media. I think it's Orwellian. I think it should be called anti-social media, which is more which is truer to the experience of the medium. But I think Jews need to think carefully about how they engage and what they do on social media. I can just tell you that my own life has been immeasurably improved since I got completely off of social media. And sometimes these are battles worth fighting, and sometimes they're battles worth avoiding, right? Social media is uniquely geared to give the bullies and the bigots the upper hand. So there are some cases in which the best thing to do is not engage. I'm not sure if I don't want to make a sweeping statement, but I get this question all the time. And sometimes refusing to engage, not being goaded into battles with unseen bullies on the other side, is a wiser way of conducting business than it is to sort of go through the looking glass and fight these battles endlessly.
I'd like to turn to, I'll call geopolitical or political issues, and ask you about this new government. You wrote a great piece on this new Israeli-Bennett-Lapid coalition. You called it unholy, and you had a great line. You said ideological treason can also be a form of civic patriotism.
Yeah, unholy was in quotation marks. I just want to stress that. Look, here the accusation is that Israel is this apartheid state, right? That is the chief factor of oppression throughout the Middle East, and that it is being governed indefinitely by a de facto dictator named Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a bigot who will never be removed from power. And lo and behold, 6 weeks after the Gaza war, 6 weeks after this terrible internecine fighting in Akko and Lod and other Arab Israeli cities, you have a government that has an Islamist as a key partner of the coalition, that has a gay man as head of the health ministry, that has an Ethiopian black woman as head of the immigration and absorption ministry, and has an Arab Israeli as head of the regional integration ministry. The prime minister is right wing. The foreign minister and his successor is very much a centrist. It is a phenomenal demonstration, in my view, of the vibrancy of Israeli civic democracy at just the moment when kind of the conventional wisdom was that Israel was this land of irreconcilable tribes and that the divisions in Israel were going to bring this country down. What did you see? You saw this civic patriotism based on people willing to break ideologically with their own side, at least break a little. And that, to me, is what a healthy society is all about. Can you just put to one side your own immediate ideological or personal convictions to look for a larger civic interest? Israel did that. And it's incredible. Show me a coalition in Canada or the United States or any of the Western countries, which sometimes have mixed political coalitions, that's quite as diverse, quite as inclusive as what Israel just succeeded in doing. So again, this is not Hasbara. I'm letting the facts speak for themselves. Every sentence that I offered you just now is demonstrably, verifiably true.
I've got to ask you briefly on one state versus two-state solution. You say you've always supported a two-state solution, just not now. A Palestinian state's a good idea in theory, but for now, a terrible idea in practice. And especially in light of the legislation that was introduced today, I think, in Congress, where part of the Democratic Party is introducing legislation that is, I think it's called the Two-State Act. You'll know better than I will, but it reintroduces the American commitment. Headline was Democrats trying to make the two-state solution relevant again in Congress. Not likely to pass, but it's meant to both accelerate progress towards such a solution while discouraging actions to put it out of reach.
Yeah, look, Israel should not govern indefinitely over millions of Palestinians who don't want to be governed by Israel. And Palestinians shouldn't have to have so much of their life determined by the actions of the Israeli government. So in theory, a two-state solution is the ideal outcome. And we should labor towards that while knowing that it could take 10 or 50 years. The key condition is not whether you can figure out the territorial lines that need to be drawn, right? You're in Canada, we're here in the United States. If tomorrow Point Roberts out in Western Canada was returned to Canada, right? We would just, even everyone in Point Roberts would just shrug, right? It's because our values are essentially identical. They're both democratic, liberal. It's a border that matters, but doesn't matter all that much. The problem that Israel has with the Palestinian, with a Palestinian state today, or the prospect of a Palestinian state today, isn't about where you draw the borders. It's whether a self-governing Palestinian state can have enough pluralism, liberalism, democracy, tolerance, and above all, a willingness to live in an enduring peace with its neighbors, that Israel could safely create that state. Because the last thing Israel needs is recreating what the Gaza Strip has become in the West Bank. So what are steps that Israel could take? Yeah, absolutely. It should be very cautious about where it builds new housing, new settlements. At some point, much of that land might become essential to a viable Palestinian state. I'm not opposed to that. But what I am opposed to is saying this is a desired outcome, and so we have to do it right now. It's like trying to induce a baby in the 20th week of pregnancy. It's going to result in tragedy. So let's be mindful of what the long-term goal is, but let's be practical and thoughtful and sensible about how we get to it.
On that note, I want to point out that you are the editor-in-chief of a new publication called Sapir, and in the most recent issue of that, dealing with power, you wrote an essay that I'm going to recommend to our viewers as compulsory reading. And you say the necessity of Jewish power, that the state of Israel is born, raised, and remains under fire, isn't a sign of the failure of Zionism. It's a reminder of its necessity. We're running out of time. I do want to, you tell a story that's a very emotional story, and I just want to, 2 paragraphs long, and it's going to be 2, I'll volunteer to read it because it's an emotional story for me to read, as someone who came at a young age to this country to leave the ashes of the Holocaust behind. So you write this story, and with your permission, I'll just recite this personal story that you wrote here, and it's the story of Chaya Westerman. And I'll read this, it's short. You say, in December 1941, on a beach on the Latvian coast called Skeda, German soldiers and their local henchmen murdered 2,749 Jewish women and children, stripping them of their underclothes and shooting them in groups of 10 over 3 days. Among those victims were 3 members of my extended family, Chaya Westerman and her sisters. Shortly before she was murdered, she told an acquaintance, "If you meet any of my children, tell them I was not afraid. Tell them to continue living, knowing that I was not afraid." That acquaintance survived and did, in fact, meet Chaya's daughter, Rhea Mazen, to whom she told a story of her mother's final days. I came to know Rhea many years later in Israel, where she and her husband had emigrated in the early 70s. Her husband had long since passed away, but she had a son and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and she lived an active life right until her death a few years ago at 96. She too died unafraid, but unlike her mother, she died knowing that thanks to Jewish power, there is a Jewish future, a future in which what happened on that beach 80 years ago will never happen again. And so it's good to end on never again. I appreciate your coming today. I promised the Q&A. I don't know if I've got time for a Q&A. Can you give me a chat room, Dylan, so I can, we've got loads of questions and too much to cover, and you're too eloquent to be shortened in any way. One question is, how do we proactively deal with the anti-Semitism we see in the media? It's sort of pretty broad.
Call it out. Call it by its name. And let's be clear, anti-Zionism is 21st century anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is not criticism of Israel. We all criticize Israel. You have, I have. That's normal. Calling for the destruction of an entire state on exactly the same grounds that people called for the destruction of an entire people 80 years ago is anti-Semitism. If you want to cite a few Meshuggah rabbis who don't feel like that, that's fine. There are exceptions to everything, but at least those rabbis have something like standing. 99% of anti-Zionism today doesn't have that kind of standing, and things need to be called by their name. We are not, we don't act as fools when people call the marchers at Charlottesville very fine people, right? We understand what that means. So let's not be bamboozled by the blinkers of giving the enemies of the Jewish people consistently the benefit of the doubt.
Bret, thank you very much. It's been an incredible hour. It's flown by. It's been insightful. Your insights are welcome, well thought out. You set the standard for what journalism should be. Thank you for everything you do, and best of luck to you and all your future endeavors.
Thank you, and all the best to my friends in Toronto. It's a beautiful city, and throughout Canada, a wonderful country that I'd like to visit again when this period is over.
Well, the border's now open, I think, so we've got an open invitation. Come visit us in Toronto. Thank you very much.
Bret, thank you for the tremendous honor and tremendous privilege of hosting you tonight, and for taking the time to educate, to inspire, and to empower us. On behalf of Honest Reporting Canada, our 50,000 subscribers, and the 1,000 people in attendance today, thank you for everything you do for Israel and for the Jewish people's welfare. To our viewers of today's important briefing, thank you all for being here tonight. As you know, our efforts are only made possible thanks to your support, and we're deeply grateful for your patronage. It powers important events like these and helps us to monitor media bias against Israel. So if you'd like to be a sponsor of our work, I encourage you to go to www.honestreporting.ca/donate. Thank you all for your support of our continued efforts in fighting media bias against Israel. Good evening.